All right, so get ready, because today we're doing a deep dive into the world of internal auditing.
Ooh, exciting.
We've gotten a lot of requests from our listeners to really unpack the global internal audit standards.
The ones from the IAA, right?
Yes, the Institute of Internal Auditors, and these standards were actually just updated in January 2024.
So we're looking at the freshest guidance out there.
Absolutely, and you know these standards are important because they really form the foundation for how organizations of all types.
I mean, from massive global companies all the way to, like, your local school board.
Right. They use these standards to ensure that they're operating efficiently, ethically, and, well, effectively, basically making sure things are running smoothly.
And what I find really fascinating is that the IIA is very upfront about the fact that these standards aren't just some kind of internal rule book.
There's a bigger picture here.
Yeah, they emphasize that these standards are all about serving the public interest.
So it's not just about making sure the numbers add up in some spreadsheet?
No, it's about making sure that organizations are acting responsibly and ethically, which ultimately impacts everyone listening, all of us.
So even if I'm not an auditor, these standards, in a way, are kind of looking out for me.
You got it. And something that really reinforces that idea is how these standards were actually developed.
Okay, so tell me about that.
Well, the IIA really emphasizes getting public input. They want to hear from a wide range of voices.
To make sure everyone's interests are represented.
Exactly, not just a select few. So it's a very transparent process, which I think helps build trust in the whole system.
Okay, so even if I'm not an auditor, these standards, in a way, are looking out for me. That's a pretty cool concept.
For sure, and I think it speaks to how seriously the IIA takes its role,
Absolutely. Now the document itself breaks down internal auditing into 5 main domains.
Purpose, ethics, governing, managing, and performing. Always have to look those up. I can never remember all 5.
There are a lot. How do these domains all kind of fit together?
Well, you can think of them as like interlocking pieces of a puzzle. They're all connected.
Creating a, holistic approach.
Yeah, and they build on each other. So for example, domain 3, governing. That focuses on how internal audit functions are actually overseen and managed.
Within an organization.
Exactly. So it's all about who the internal audit activity reports to, how it's structured, things like that.
So even the auditors are being audited, in a sense.
Right. And this domain really stresses the importance of independence from management for the internal audit function.
Which makes sense. You need that separation to make sure the auditors can actually do their job objectively.
Exactly. Without feeling any pressure or undue influence.
Now, what about smaller organizations or teams? Would these standards, which seem to be, designed for larger organizations, would they still apply to them?
That's a really great question. And actually, the IIA specifically acknowledges that smaller internal audit functions often have limited resources.
Fewer people, maybe a smaller budget.
Yeah, exactly. And so the standards actually offer guidance on how to adapt the principles and still maintain their integrity, even in those resource-constrained environments.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach?
No, it's about finding practical solutions that work for different contexts, but without compromising those fundamental principles.
So even a one-person internal audit team could find these standards useful?
Oh, absolutely. It's about tailoring the approach without compromising those fundamental principles, right?
Right. And, speaking of tailoring the approach, the standards even offer specific guidance for the public sector.
Yes. They recognize that government agencies and organizations often face unique challenges, and so they need a slightly different approach.
What kind of challenges are we talking about here?
Well, think about the legal frameworks that often dictate how internal audit functions operate in the public sector.
Oh, right. They're often very specific laws and regulations.
Exactly, and those laws often mean there's less flexibility compared to private companies.
They have to follow a very strict set of rules.
And then you've also got public disclosure laws, which are incredibly important in the public sector.
Because transparency is paramount when you're dealing with taxpayer money.
Absolutely. So those laws have a huge impact on how auditors handle information.
It's not just about protecting the organization, it's about being accountable to the public.
Right. And then you throw in the role of elected officials.
Which adds another layer of complexity.
For sure. Because elected officials often have a big influence on oversight and accountability.
Which can create some, let's say, interesting dynamics for internal auditors.
Definitely. It can be a very different ballgame compared to the private sector.
But it sounds like these standards offer at least a framework for navigating those complexities.
Exactly. They provide that foundation, that solid ground to stand on.
Okay, so we've talked about this broad overview, these 5 domains, but let's zoom in a bit and let's delve into a crucial part of these standards. Domain through ethics and professionalism.
Okay, yeah, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of how auditors are supposed to behave, right?
Yeah, exactly. It outlines those behavioral expectations.
It's like the auditor's code of conduct.
And right off the bat, the first principle mentioned is integrity. Seems like that's the cornerstone of the whole auditing profession.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, integrity is about being honest, having the courage to speak up, and just doing the right thing, especially when it's hard.
Yeah, because auditors are often dealing with really sensitive information, potential fraud, and they're holding people accountable.
They need a strong moral compass, that's for sure.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, it's about having the guts to actually enforce them even when you're facing pressure.
Exactly, and the standards actually have a specific standard about this. It's 1.2, I believe.
What does that one say?
It talks about how auditors need to understand and respect the legitimate and ethical expectations of the organization, which I find really interesting.
It seems to suggest that there's some nuance there, some critical thinking involved, not just blindly following a checklist.
I think that's a great point.
So how do auditors navigate those gray areas where, legitimate expectations might clash with ethical considerations?
Well, that's where professional judgment comes in. Auditors can't just hide behind the rules. They have to understand the spirit of those rules.
Right, and apply them ethically, even when they're facing really complex situations.
Absolutely. And that ability to navigate those complexities is what makes the difference between a good auditor and a great auditor.
It's about being ethically savvy. I like that term.
Right. And it all comes back to ensuring that internal audit functions are actually serving the public good, which is the whole point, right?
Okay, so we've established that integrity is key. What other crucial principles are outlined in these standards?
Well, another big one is objectivity, which basically means auditors need to remain unbiased in their assessments.
Okay, so objectivity sounds simple enough.
It does. But this is where things get really interesting and sometimes tricky. It really is. Objectivity is essential for auditors to stay unbiased in their work,
So no rose-colored glasses allowed.
Exactly. No rose-colored glasses. You can't be swayed by personal opinions or biases or even pressure from other people.
You gotta let the evidence speak for itself.
Yes. You have to approach every situation with a clear and impartial mindset and just let the evidence guide your judgment.
But how do the standards actually ensure that auditors are staying objective? In a practical sense.
Well, the standards actually provide this whole framework for identifying and managing threats to objectivity.
Threats? What kind of threats?
Well, they could be things like conflicts of interest.
That makes sense.
Right. Or accepting gifts, or even having a previous working relationship with the area that you're auditing.
Oh yeah, I can see how those kinds of things could cloud an auditor's judgment.
Exactly. So the standards lay out ways to manage these situations, to keep things, above board.
Can you give me a more concrete example?
Sure. Imagine you have an auditor who, used to manage the procurement department.
Okay, they know all the ins and outs.
Right. And so according to the standards, they might need to wait a year before auditing that same department.
Kind of like a cooling off period?
Yes. A cooling off period, exactly, to make sure their judgment isn't influenced by past relationships or loyalties.
That seems pretty sensible.
And it helps maintain the perception of objectivity too, which is just as important as actually being objective.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Right. Even if you are truly unbiased, if it looks like you might be swayed by something, that can damage the credibility of the whole audit.
So it's not just about being objective, it's also about appearing objective.
Precisely. And this commitment to objectivity extends to how auditors handle sensitive information too.
Oh, right, because they have access to all sorts of confidential data.
Exactly. They need to maintain confidentiality, protect the privacy of individuals, and of course the organization itself.
It's a huge responsibility.
It is, and the standards are very clear about this. They emphasize the importance of following strict protocols.
For handling and storing all that information.
Yep. And even disposing of it properly,
To make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands.
Exactly. It's all about maintaining trust and respecting the confidentiality that's been placed in you.
It's almost like a doctor-patient relationship.
I like that analogy.
That level of professional confidentiality where your information is safe.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it.
But doesn't the auditor's responsibility to the public sometimes clash with the need to protect an organization's confidential information?
That's a really good point. There can be instances where those obligations conflict, and those situations are tough.
Yeah, they require some careful consideration and judgment.
For sure. And that's where professional skepticism comes in, which is another key concept in the standards.
So auditors can't just take everything at face value.
Nope, they need to dig deeper, ask tough questions, and be really critical of the information they receive. They can't just accept things blindly.
So it's not enough to just be ethical and unbiased. You also need the skills and knowledge to really effectively assess what you're looking at.
Exactly, and that brings us to another core principle outlined in these standards. Competency.
Competency.
Yeah. Auditors have to have the necessary expertise to perform their duties thoroughly and effectively.
So it's a constant learning process.
It is, and the standards actually emphasize the importance of continuous professional development.
So auditors are expected to stay up to date on industry trends, new regulations, best practices, all that stuff.
Absolutely. It's about maintaining that professional edge and making sure you have the skills to tackle increasingly complex challenges.
Because, let's face it, the world is not getting any simpler.
No, it's not. And as the world becomes more complex, so do the challenges facing internal auditors.
They need to be adaptable, knowledgeable, and, skilled in navigating all those complexities.
Exactly. So competency is just as important as those ethical considerations we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so we've talked about integrity, objectivity, competency. What other core principles do these standards emphasize?
Well, there's also due professional care, which basically means you have to approach your work with diligent skepticism and a real commitment to quality.
Diligence and skepticism, those sound like essential qualities for any good investigator.
They really are, because you can't just accept things at face value. You have to be a critical thinker, constantly looking for those red flags.
Or inconsistencies or areas where, further investigation is needed.
Exactly, and you have to be willing to challenge assumptions and not be afraid to raise concerns, even if it ruffles some feathers.
I'm sensing a theme here.
What's that?
It's not enough for auditors to simply follow a checklist.
I agree.
They need to think critically, exercise professional judgment, and have the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult.
You're absolutely right, and that brings us to another essential element: communication.
Communication. Seems like that's a critical factor in almost every profession.
It really is. But in the context of auditing, effective communication is just, paramount.
So what does effective communication look like in the world of auditing? Is it just about, issuing those formal reports at the end?
It's way more than that. It's about building relationships with stakeholders, explaining those complex issues clearly and concisely in a way that everyone can understand.
And ultimately driving positive change within the organization.
Yes, it's about fostering that collaboration and ensuring that everyone's on the same page.
So it's not about auditors acting as the audit police. It's more like they're partners working with the organization to improve its operations.
Exactly. Auditors have to work really closely with management, the board, and everyone else involved, and make sure everyone understands the issues, the risks, and the proposed solutions.
I imagine transparency is key to all of that, to building that trust and collaboration.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the standards actually require auditors to disclose any instances where they haven't fully conformed with the standards themselves.
So they have to be upfront about any limitations or challenges they encountered during the audit.
Yep, total transparency. It's about being accountable and ensuring that the audit's findings are credible, even if they weren't able to follow every single step to the letter.
So it's like a system of checks and balances, even for the auditors themselves.
Exactly. Everyone's got to be accountable.
But how does all this high-level theory translate into the real world? What does an actual audit look like in practice?
Well, it's it all starts with a plan.
Okay, so before they even set foot in an organization.
Right. They've got to know what they're looking for, right?
Makes sense.
So the auditors, they need to understand the scope of the audit, identify any potential risks.
And those risks would be specific to that organization.
Oh yeah, every organization is different.
And then based on those risks, they kind of come up with a game plan.
Yeah, exactly. They develop a detailed work program, step by step, what they're going to do.
So it's like a roadmap for the audit process.
Exactly. A roadmap of that.
So there's a lot of strategic thinking involved even before they start digging into the actual data.
Oh, for sure. It's not just a matter of showing up and randomly checking things.
You gotta have a plan.
Right. They need to be really methodical and make sure everything they do aligns with the overall objectives of the audit.
And I imagine communication is super important during this planning phase too.
Absolutely. They need to be keeping management in the loop, making sure everyone is on the same page.
About the goals, the timeline, all of that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a collaborative process right from the start.
Okay, so what happens after the plan is in place?
Well, then the real fun begins, you know.
The detective work.
Exactly. To start gathering information.
Okay, so how do they do that?
It can involve reviewing documents, interviewing employees.
Oh, right, getting that firsthand perspective.
Exactly. And they might observe processes, you know, like actually see how things are done.
To get a feel for the workflow.
Right. And they might also use some data analysis tools to like really dig into the numbers.
So it's a combination of like qualitative and quantitative information.
You got it.
They're piecing together all these different pieces of the puzzle.
To get a holistic view of what's happening in the organization.
And I imagine while they're doing all this information gathering, they're constantly applying those principles of objectivity and professional skepticism that we talked about earlier.
Oh, absolutely. Those principles are always top of mind.
So it's not just about collecting data, it's about looking at it with a critical eye, always on the lookout for red flags or inconsistencies.
Right. You got to be thinking critically every step of the way.
What happens after that, after the information gathering and analysis phase?
Well, that's when they start identifying potential findings, you know,
Findings meaning?
like areas where there might be a gap between, say, what the organization's policies say should be happening.
Right, like the ideal scenario.
Exactly. And then what's actually happening in practice.
So they're identifying areas where the organization might be falling short.
Yeah. And that could be due to a bunch of things like inefficiencies.
Maybe they just don't have a good process in place.
Right. Or maybe there's a lack of controls, or in some cases, it could be something more serious.
Like intentional wrongdoing.
Exactly. But of course, you know, not all findings are created equal.
Right, some might be minor procedural issues, others might be bigger problems.
Sure. So the auditors actually have to evaluate the significance of each finding.
And how do they do that?
Well, they consider a bunch of factors like the potential impact of the issue, you know, how bad could it be if this thing really went south?
And how likely is it to actually occur?
Yeah, exactly. And they also look at the organization's overall risk tolerance. You know, some organizations are more comfortable with risk than others.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Nope. Each situation is unique.
Okay, so once they've identified these findings and kind of categorized them based on severity, what happens next?
But then they move on to developing recommendations for improvement.
Okay, so it's not just about pointing fingers and saying, you're doing this wrong.
No, it's about actually helping the organization.
Providing solutions.
Right, and these recommendations, they got to be practical, you know?
Something the organization can actually implement.
And they should be aimed at addressing the root cause of the issue, not just putting a Band-Aid on it.
So it's about making things better in the long run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the auditors work closely with management during this phase.
To make sure the recommendations are feasible.
Yeah, and to develop an action plan for how to actually implement the recommendations.
So it's a collaborative effort.
It is, for sure.
I'm sensing that communication piece is really crucial throughout this whole process.
It's huge EE. I mean, auditors have to be able to clearly and concisely explain their findings.
So everyone understands what's going on.
Exactly. They need to provide the evidence to back up their conclusions, but they also need to do it in a way that's, you know, understandable and not overly technical.
So it's striking that balance between being thorough and being accessible.
You got it.
Okay, so what happens after all of that?
Well, once the audit is complete, they issue a final report.
Which kind of summarizes everything they've found.
Yep, their findings, recommendations, conclusions, the whole shebang.
And who gets to see this report?
It goes to management, the board, and any other relevant stakeholders.
So everyone's kept in the loop.
Yeah, full transparency.
But it doesn't just end there, right? The auditors don't just drop the report and walk away.
You're absolutely right. They need to follow up.
To make sure those recommendations are actually implemented.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that the organization is actually taking steps to address the issues they identified.
So it's a continuous cycle.
It is a continuous process of assessing, recommending, implementing, and following up.
Well, you know, I have to say, I think this whole deep dive has really been eye-opening.
Yeah. What stands out to you?
I think it's just fascinating to see how all these principles and standards work together to create this framework for ethical and effective internal auditing.
It is pretty cool how it all comes together.
You know, we started out talking about integrity and objectivity, and now we've walked through the practical steps involved in an audit. It really shows that internal auditing is much more than just, you know, numbers and checklists.
It's definitely more than just crunching numbers.
It's a profession that demands critical thinking, ethical judgment, and a real commitment to serving the public interest.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, to our listeners out there, as you go about your day, think about the organizations you interact with, your bank, your local government, the businesses you patronize. Behind the scenes, internal auditors are hard at work, making sure those organizations are operating ethically, responsibly, and effectively.
They're the unsung heroes of good governance, you know.
It's a reminder that good governance and accountability are essential for a well-functioning society. And internal auditors, they play a crucial role in upholding those values.
For sure, they're like the guardians of integrity.
That's a great way to put it. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I hope you learned something new. We certainly did. And as always, keep those questions coming.
We love hearing from you, so keep them coming.